Do you know which objects Saint Teresa of Jesus had in mind when she warned that certain things in a Christian home need to go before the sacred Triduum begins? You wouldn't guess them. You'd never suspect them, but you have them. They're there right now, tucked somewhere in your home, occupying a space that during these holy days simply does not belong to them. Teresa didn't hint at this. She wrote it down. And this next question may sting a little, because no woman of faith tends to say it out loud. She's afraid of the answer. The question is this: how much grace has been blocked in your home by something you placed there with love, without ever realizing what you were doing? That question has an answer. And Teresa left it in writing with a precision that still surprises us today, because she wasn't talking about cursed objects or dark presences. She was talking about something far closer, far more ordinary, far more personal. Have you ever felt that your home during Holy Week doesn't feel any different from the rest of the year? That something seems to prevent these days from being truly set apart, holier, fuller, more alive? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Because what Teresa warned about those objects, which ones they are, and why this Holy Wednesday is the exact moment to remove them, that is exactly what lies ahead. And it was kept for you long before you ever found your way here. Saint Teresa of Avila did not live in the world of abstract ideas. She lived in real convents, with real walls, real objects she touched and moved and placed and put away with her own hands. And it was precisely in that concrete, physical life, in daily contact with the material surroundings of her foundations, that she came to understand something her writings reveal with a clarity we often overlook. The space that surrounds the body is not indifferent to the soul. It is not a neutral backdrop against which spiritual life happens in spite of it. It is part of spiritual life. The home is part of the interior journey, and everything in it, every object, every image, every corner kept tidy or left in disarray, speaks to the soul in a silent language the soul understands, even when the mind has no words to translate it. In the interior castle, Teresa describes the soul as a castle made of diamond or very clear crystal, with many rooms, just as in heaven there are many dwelling places. That image is not merely a metaphor for the interior life. It is also a teaching about the relationship between what is within and what surrounds us. A castle has walls, it has gates, it has an environment around it that largely determines what can enter, what can leave, what can grow within its walls, and what cannot find the conditions to do so. Teresa knew this because she had lived it firsthand. She had lived in houses where grace flowed with a remarkable ease, and she had lived in houses where something held it back, where the soul met resistance, not within itself, but in what surrounded it, in the things that occupied the visible spaces, in what her eyes landed on each time she looked up from her prayer book. For Teresa, this was not a matter of personal sensitivity or a delicate temperament. It was something she had distilled from years of deep prayer, from the spiritual direction of dozens of souls, from attentive observation of her own sisters in the convent. When a sister came to her saying her prayer was dry, that she could not concentrate, that her soul felt inexplicably heavy, Teresa did not begin with the soul. She began with the surroundings. She looked at the oratory. She looked at the cell. She looked at the objects occupying the spaces where that sister spent her hours of prayer. Because she had learned, with the patience that only comes through repeated experience, that exterior disorder is almost always the reflection of an interior disorder that has not yet been named, and that sometimes that exterior disorder is also its cause, not merely its consequence. The Christian home for Teresa was not simply the place where one lives. It was the first space of the spiritual life. It was where the soul either began or interrupted its journey toward God, before opening any book, before kneeling in any church, before speaking any prayer aloud. If the environment was arranged to welcome grace, the soul found the path clear. If the environment was loaded with elements that turned the heart outward, toward the world, toward noise, toward what Teresa called with precise language the things of the age, the soul had to work twice as hard to reach the same place. And often that extra effort left it so spent that by the time it reached the threshold of deep prayer, it no longer had the strength to cross it. And here is where Teresa's warning carries its full weight for us today. Because she was not speaking of neglected homes or faithless people. She was speaking of the homes of devout people, women who prayed the rosary every night, who received communion on Sundays, who went to confession regularly, who loved God with a sincerity no one could question. And yet, in those homes, there were objects blocking something, not through anyone's ill will, not through deliberate carelessness, simply because no one had taught them to look at their own home with the eyes of the soul, with that contemplative gaze Teresa had developed over decades, which allowed her to see in physical spaces what most people cannot see because they don't know it exists. That gaze is precisely what Teresa offers us. And it carries a particular urgency in these days because Holy Week is not a liturgical season like any other. It is the center of the Christian year. It is the moment when the grace of God pours out upon the world with an intensity that has no equal in any other period of the calendar. The passion, death, and resurrection of Christ are not events commemorated from a distance, like something that happened long ago and can no longer be touched. They are events the Church makes present, real, living, active, in every Christian home that prepares to receive them with the fullness of its being and its space. And the word that matters is precisely this: prepared. A home that is prepared receives what an unprepared home lets pass by without anyone noticing, without anyone knowing what was lost, without anyone being able to recover it afterward, because grace does not return with the same intensity once the moment has passed. Not because God is selective, or because grace comes with arbitrary conditions to be decoded, but because the disposition of the soul and its surroundings is the very condition that God Himself, in His infinite respect for human freedom, has always chosen to honor. Teresa understood it this way because she had lived it, and because she had seen it lived by the women she accompanied throughout her life. In each of her foundations, before the first sister set foot in the new house, Teresa would walk through every room, not as a visitor, not as an inspector, but as a woman of prayer who could read space with the same care she brought to reading a sacred text. She noted every corner. She took in every object. She asked about the history of each thing she found in those houses that were about to become places of encounter between the soul and God. And she removed what did not belong, not with drama or ceremony, but with the same calm practicality with which a good mother prepares a room before her child comes home. That practice was not a quirk, nor an expression of a perfectionist temperament. It was the concrete expression of a deep theological conviction that preparing a space for the presence of God is an act of faith as real and as meritorious as kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament. That the outward order of the home is a silent prayer the soul offers before a single word is spoken. That some objects help the soul to rise, orienting it upward with a gentleness that is barely perceptible, but accumulates its effect over time. And that other objects, without anyone intending it or planning it, anchor it to the ground with the same quiet, steady persistence. Which objects are those? Teresa knew them. She had identified them over decades of contemplative life and foundations spread across Spain. And the answer is not where most people instinctively look. It is not in what appears obviously out of place in a Christian home. It is in something far more ordinary, far closer, far more present in the home of any woman of faith who has spent years building her devotion with love and consistency, not realizing that part of what she has built needs to be reviewed with fresh eyes before this Holy Wednesday ends and the Triduum begins without her ready to receive it with everything she is and everything she has. The liturgical calendar is not simply a list of religious dates distributed across the year for for the faithful to remember and observe. It is an architecture of time. The Church does not organize the Christian year merely to commemorate past events from a respectful distance. It organizes it to make those events accessible to the soul in the present, to create the precise conditions in which the grace that flowed at a particular moment in history can flow again with the same intensity and the same transformative power upon every person who prepares to receive it with an open heart and a ready home. And within that architecture, there is one period that holds a completely singular place, the sacred Triduum. The Triduum begins with the Mass of the Lord's Supper on the evening of Holy Thursday and culminates with the Easter Vigil on the night of Holy Saturday. These are 3 days the Church does not divide or separate in its celebration. They form a single liturgical act, the longest and most dense of the entire year, in which the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ are celebrated as what they are in their deepest reality. One mystery, one movement of God's infinite love toward humanity, one redemptive act that the Church makes present again, so that every soul can be touched by it in a way no other moment of the year allows, with the same depth. Holy Wednesday is the threshold of that Triduum. It is the last day before that mystery opens fully. It is the day when ordinary time still exists, when hands can still move freely to prepare what needs to be prepared, when the home can still be put in order without interrupting anything sacred, because the sacred hasn't yet begun in its fullness. And it is precisely for that reason that Teresa would have recognized in this day an opportunity that cannot be postponed. Because what is not done before the threshold cannot be done with the same freedom once it has been crossed. Teresa of Avila understood the spiritual weight of thresholds better than almost anyone of her time. In her foundations, the day before the first sisters arrived was always a day of intense and fully conscious preparation, not a day of rest or passive waiting, but a day of concrete, deliberate action, oriented toward a single goal she never lost sight of, that when grace arrived at the new convent, the space would be completely ready to receive it. Teresa never arrived at a new house and waited for time to put things in order on its own. She put things in order before the sacred time began, because she had learned, with a certainty her writings transmit intact to this day, that grace does not wait, it comes. And if the space is not ready when it arrives, it passes by without announcing itself, without leaving any sign of its passage, without anyone ever knowing what was missed. That understanding of the threshold is exactly what Holy Wednesday represents for the Christian home in any age. It is not yet Good Friday, it is not yet Holy Thursday, it is the day before, the day of the threshold, the day when there is still time to do what was not done earlier without that delay being irreparable. The day when preparation is no longer anticipatory but urgent, because what is not ordered today cannot be ordered tomorrow without interrupting what tomorrow demands, a complete and undivided presence. And here is where many people of deep faith make a mistake Teresa would have recognized immediately, because she had watched it repeat itself in her own communities. They wait to feel Holy Week before they prepare for Holy Week. They wait for the spiritual emotion to come first, for the heart to move toward devotion on its own, and for the preparation of the home to follow as a natural consequence of that interior movement. But Teresa taught exactly the opposite, with an insistence her writings reflect on more than one occasion. Preparing the surroundings is not the consequence of devotion already present. It is the condition that makes devotion possible. You do not prepare the home because you already feel God there. You prepare the home so that God can be felt there. The order of these two movements is not interchangeable. It is irreversible. This explains with an unmistakable clarity why some homes live Holy Week with a depth that seems completely disproportionate to the conscious effort of those who live there, and why other homes with the same rites, the same prayers, the same masses, the same goodwill, produce a far more surface-level and forgettable interior experience. Not because the people in one case are holier than in the other, but because the environment in one case is prepared and in the other it is not. And the soul responds to that difference with a fidelity that its owners often cannot explain until someone shows them what has been happening all along. The dryness in prayer that so many people experience during Holy Week, that specific feeling that the words slide off, that the heart is not moved even though the will is fully present, that something invisible is placing a distance between the soul and the mystery being celebrated, is not always a spiritual crisis requiring special accompaniment. Sometimes it is simply the predictable result of a home that has not been prepared to receive what these days bring. A home where there are objects that should not be there, not because they are evil by nature, but because in this particular season, in these specific days of the liturgical year, their presence creates an interference the soul registers even when the mind cannot find the words to name it. What specific objects belong to that category of interference? Teresa did not list them in a tidy inventory. That was not her style or her purpose. But she left the principles in her writings with such clarity that the list builds itself when those principles are applied honestly to any person of faith's home. And those objects fall into 3 distinct groups, each with its own logic, each with its own way of acting upon the soul, each requiring a different response that the Church has articulated with precision across centuries of living tradition. The first of those groups is the one that surprises most when it is named, because it includes objects found in nearly every Catholic home, objects no one would ever have thought to identify as an obstacle to grace. The first category of objects Teresa identified as incompatible with deep spiritual recollection are not what anyone would picture when hearing that description. They are not dark or strange or obviously out of place in a Christian home. They are completely ordinary objects present in almost every household that no one would spontaneously associate with the word obstacle. They are the objects of noise. And when Teresa spoke of noise in her writings, she was not referring only to audible sound, to voices or instruments filling the air. She meant something both broader and more precise, everything that orients the soul's attention toward the surface of life, toward distraction, toward what she called, in the way of perfection, the things of the world, things not evil in themselves, but which in certain times and certain spaces become a real and measurable obstacle to the interior recollection that deep prayer requires. In the way of perfection, Teresa writes about the difficulty the soul has in gathering itself when the environment is filled with stimuli constantly pulling at its attention in scattered, fragmented ways. She does not condemn them with the harshness of someone who has never known the temptation. She does not call them sin or demand their permanent removal from ordinary Christian life. But she identifies them with clinical precision as practical obstacles to contemplative prayer, the deepest, most transformative form of communion between the soul and God. And she writes something her contemporaries found remarkably accurate, and which we, reading it from our own century, find even more pertinent. The soul cannot be in 2 places at the same time. If the environment calls it outward, toward a distracting image, toward an object that recalls the world, the soul must make an extra effort to turn inward. And that extra effort, precisely in times of intense grace, such as the days of the Sacred Triduum, is what prevents grace from penetrating to the deepest layers of the soul where true transformation takes place. What objects produce that noise in the Christian home of today? Teresa did not know them by the names we use because she lived in a different century. But she left a principle so clear and so applicable that the identification is immediate when it is taken seriously. Any object that fragments the soul's attention, that orients it toward purposeless entertainment, toward comfortable distraction, toward images that neither build up nor lift the spirit, is an object of noise. And in the 21st century home, those objects take very concrete, and very familiar forms. Screens left on without any specific purpose, emitting continuous light and movement even when no one is really watching, create a visual and auditory presence in the home that the soul registers even when the conscious mind has long since normalized it. Entertainment magazines stacked on the coffee table, secular calendars hanging on the same walls as sacred images, creating a visual jumble the eye processes without distinction, and which the soul eventually treats with the same casual indifference it applies to everything that has become too familiar. Decorative objects with no spiritual orientation that nonetheless occupy the most visible spots in the home, the places where the eye rests naturally, where the heart reaches for something to settle on when the mind is tired and needs an anchor. Teresa was extraordinarily precise about the relationship between the gaze and the soul. She knew, with a certainty born of her own prayer experience and of her observation of hundreds of souls, that the soul follows the eyes with a faithfulness that is consistently underestimated. What the eyes encounter repeatedly in the everyday environment eventually becomes, over time, and without anyone consciously deciding it, the interior landscape of the soul. If the eyes habitually rest on images that do not lift, on objects that belong entirely to the horizontal world of ordinary life, the soul adjusts to a level of flight that prevents it from reaching what God wants to give it when He opens His hand during times of special grace. This is not a conscious process or a deliberate decision made with bad intent. It is simply the law of environment operating with the same constancy and impartiality with which all natural laws operate. We become slowly and without noticing what surrounds us. Teresa had watched it work in her own sisters with a regularity that left no room for doubt. Sisters who lived in cells that were ordered and clear of unnecessary objects advanced in prayer with a speed that surprised even the most seasoned among them. Sisters who accumulated small objects without spiritual orientation, out of affection, out of habit, out of that unconscious fear of emptiness we sometimes confuse with interior poverty, found the path to contemplation considerably more difficult and considerably slower. That is why Teresa was so careful, almost meticulous, about what was placed in the oratories of her convents and in the cells of her sisters, not out of rigidity or austerity turned into an end in itself, but because she had understood, with the clarity only repeated experience provides, that every object present in a space of prayer is a silent instruction the soul receives and obeys without consulting the mind. An image of the crucified Christ tells the soul where to look and reminds it, without words, of the cost of the love that sustains it. An image of Our Lady of Sorrows tells the soul what to feel during these days and connects it to the grief that is also the threshold of Easter joy. A decorative object with no spiritual meaning, however harmless it seems, tells the soul that this space is not fundamentally different from any other room in the house. And the soul obeys that instruction with a docility that would be astonishing if we could see it from the outside with Teresa's eyes. During Holy Week, this principle intensifies in a way that anyone who has experienced it will immediately recognize. Not because the laws of the soul change in these days, but because the grace available during the sacred Triduum is of such particular intensity that any obstacle, however small it may be in ordinary time, becomes proportionally more costly. It is like trying to hear a soft and deeply intimate voice in a room with moderate background noise. Under normal conditions, that noise is tolerable. You learn to tune it out. The soul adapts and finds its way in spite of it. But when the voice you are trying to hear becomes more quiet and more close at the same time, as happens during the days of the Triduum, the very noise that once hindered nothing becomes a barrier the soul cannot cross on its own. What Teresa warned with a clarity her writings preserve intact for us is this: the problem with objects of noise is not that they are evil, or that their presence constitutes a sin that needs to be confessed. The problem is that they are in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the solution she would have proposed is so concrete and so straightforward that it unsettles precisely because of that. Because it requires no spiritual heroism, only a practical decision made in time. Remove those objects from visible spaces during these holy days. Put them away. Cover them if they cannot be put away. Create in the home a visual environment that tells the soul, every time the eyes settle on something, that these days are different from all the rest, and that in this space, during these days, God has absolute priority over everything else. But the objects of noise are only the first category. The second is harder to identify because it hides behind an appearance of devotion that makes it invisible at first glance. And it is precisely that invisibility which makes it the most common and the most costly of the three. There is a second category of objects in the Christian home that Teresa of Avila knew with an intimacy few of her contemporaries shared, because she had encountered them repeatedly in the houses she transformed into convents. These were not abandoned spaces or places without spiritual history. They were homes where people of faith had lived, people who had prayed in those rooms, who had placed sacred images on those walls, who had died in those beds with the rosary in their hands. And in those houses, Teresa would find something her writings describe with a precision that still surprises. Objects with an ambiguous or incomplete spiritual history. Objects that in their origin had been genuine vehicles of grace, but which carried with them a story that had never been closed. And because of that, they did not fully belong to the spiritual present of the home that sheltered them. These objects are not recognizable at first sight as obstacles. They are, very often, religious objects of a completely orthodox appearance. Sacred images, inherited rosaries, scapulars that belong to someone no longer here, crucifixes that passed from hand to hand without anyone ever thinking to make any formal gesture of reception. Holy cards that accompanied a family member through illness and which, after their death, someone put away because throwing them out seemed disrespectful, and repairing or relocating them never became urgent. Objects that in their origin were touched with genuine devotion, that accompanied real moments of prayer, that were present at the most important instance of someone's spiritual life, someone who is now gone. But they carry with them a story that has not been closed or integrated, a story of grief not fully processed, of family conflict that never found its reconciliation, of a death with no complete farewell, of devotions begun with fervor and quietly abandoned without anyone ever knowing exactly when or why. In the book of her life, Teresa writes with an honesty that surprises for its concreteness about the way the spiritual environment of a space can either facilitate or hinder progress in prayer. She describes how in certain houses she would find religious objects that, rather than creating an atmosphere of spiritual elevation, seemed to dim it in a way that had no explanation in the object's own nature. It wasn't that the crucifix was false. It wasn't that the image of Our Lady was heterodox. It was that the history attached to that object, the history of the person who had owned it before, the history of how it had come to be in that home, the history of what had happened around it without ever finding its resolution in grace, created around the object a kind of spiritual weight the soul perceived before the mind could analyze or name it. And Teresa's response to that kind of object was always the same, applied with the same calm practicality she brought to all her decisions as a foundress. First, ask about the history. Then discern with the serenity of someone who is not afraid of what they might find. And when necessary, remove it. Not with drama. Not with the grand gesture of someone performing a domestic exorcism, but with the simplicity of someone who simply recognizes that this object, in this moment, in this space, is not helping the soul to rise. The first type of object in this category is the most common and the easiest to identify once you know what you're looking for. a devotional object inherited from a deceased family member that was never blessed after being received in the new home. In Catholic tradition, devotional objects that pass from one person to another, especially when that transfer happens through death, are blessed again before being incorporated into the receiving home. Not because the object has been contaminated by the death of its previous owner, but because the blessing is the Church's gesture that formally consecrates that object to its new purpose, incorporates it into the spiritual history of the new family with the authority of sacramental grace, closes the previous history of the object, and opens the new one with an act the Church recognizes as real and effective. When that step is not taken, the object remains in a state of spiritual indetermination that is not dramatic, but is not neutral either. It is in the home, but has not been formally received by grace in that home. It has a history, but that history has not been integrated into the spiritual life of the family that now possesses it. Enduring Holy Week, when the soul's sensitivity is especially attuned to receive what the Triduum brings, that object can feel like a presence that does not quite fit, like something that belongs to a story that has not finished being told. In her own words, Saint Teresa wrote in the book of her life that the soul seeking to advance in prayer needs to take special care with what surrounds it, because the enemy, she said, does not need great occasions to trouble the soul. Small things are enough. Small disorders that seem insignificant on their own, but which together create the precise environment in which deep prayer cannot flourish. That observation, written in the 16th century, describes with an accuracy that hasn't aged precisely the situation of many Christian homes today. There is no single gravely harmful object, no dramatic spiritual negligence, but there is an accumulation of small unresolved things that together create an atmosphere in which the soul is always working slightly harder than necessary to reach where God is waiting for it. The second type of object in this category is damaged religious items that remain in the home out of a misplaced sense of reverence. Crucifixes with broken pieces, statues of saints chipped, faceless, with fragments missing that time, or accidents have taken away over the years. Holy cards that are torn or stained, tucked in a drawer because discarding them seemed irreverent, and repairing them never became a priority. These objects are not dangerous in any dramatic sense, but they are also not fulfilling the purpose for which they were made. A broken crucifix cannot say to the soul what an intact crucifix says. An image without a face cannot direct the gaze of the heart toward the saint it represents. And during Holy Week, when the soul needs every available support to rise to the height of what is being celebrated, a damaged devotional object is a support that fails precisely when it is most needed. The solution the Church offers for both types of objects is concrete, accessible, and completely within the reach of any person of faith. Inherited objects that have not been blessed are brought to the parish priest to be blessed, or blessed at home with holy water and a simple prayer of consecration. Damaged objects that can no longer fulfill their purpose are removed from visible spaces and disposed of in the way the Church indicates for deteriorated sacred objects. And in doing so, the home loses nothing that was truly working. What it gains instead is a space that is cleaner, clearer, more available for the grace that the sacred Triduum brings, with a generosity that has no limit, but which does have conditions. And the third category of objects is perhaps the most intimate of the three, the one that speaks most directly to the personal spiritual history of whoever lives in that home. The one Teresa identified with a particular tenderness because she had seen it at work in the most devoted souls she had ever known. The third category of objects Teresa identified as obstacles to grace is also the most intimate and the most difficult to address, not because it is the most serious, but because it touches most directly the personal devotional history of each person. These are devotional objects that are misplaced, out of date, or simply abandoned. And when they are named that directly, many people feel an immediate mixture of recognition and discomfort because they know exactly what is being described, even if they have never put it into words. They are the rosaries that have been sitting in the bedside drawer for months without being used. Not because one has stopped praying, but because a different one was picked up and the first was left behind, forgotten without quite being forgotten. They are the holy cards piled up on the dresser, one on top of another, some face down, some bent, some so old the image is barely visible, but no one has moved them in so long they have become part of the invisible landscape of the room. They are the small holy water fonts that were filled months ago and have not been renewed since, sitting in their familiar place, but no longer holding what they are meant to hold. They are the burned down candles that remain where they stood after going out, the wick black, the wax hardened at the bottom of the glass, because removing them requires a gesture no one has quite found the time or attention to make. They are also the small home altars that began with a clear purpose, and over time received objects no one consciously chose to place there. A folded banknote someone tucked beneath a holy image out of devotion, untouched for years. A birthday card leaning against a sacred statue because there was nowhere else to put it. A bracelet, a key ring, an entirely secular object that drifted in piece by piece until it occupied a place in the most sacred space of the home, without anyone ever deciding. Indeed, Teresa of Avila had something very precise to say about this kind of devotional accumulation. In the Foundations, she described with a clarity that left no room for confusion a principle she had applied in each of her foundations without exception. Devotion is not accumulation. The number of sacred objects in a space is not proportional to the amount of grace that space can receive, nor to the depth of faith of the person who lives there. On the contrary, Teresa had observed in her own communities that the most effective prayer spaces, those that produce the greatest spiritual fruit in the souls who used them, were the most uncluttered and most ordered. They had few objects, but each one was fully present, fully active, fully fulfilling the purpose for which it had been placed. This observation was not an aesthetic preference or a tendency toward austerity as a principle. It was the direct consequence of her understanding of the soul and how the soul relates to its surroundings. A devotional object that is in its place, clean, visible, alive in the consciousness of those who live in that home, does its silent work of orienting the heart toward God with an effectiveness that accumulates over time. A devotional object that is forgotten, dusty, mixed in with secular things, set down carelessly in any corner, does not do that work. Not because it has lost its sacred character, which cannot be lost, but because it has lost its presence in the consciousness of the person who owns it. And an object that has no presence in consciousness cannot fulfill any spiritual function, however sacred its nature may be. There is something more Teresa would add to this, and it is something her writings on the life of prayer illuminate in a way that is particularly relevant to this specific moment of the liturgical year. Abandoned or outdated devotional objects are not spiritually neutral in the sense of simply doing nothing. Sometimes they do something Teresa would have described as a subtle interference. They remind the soul unconsciously that there was a season of fervor that has passed, that there was a promise that was not kept, that there was a devotion that began with enthusiasm and quietly faded without anyone ever formally bringing it to a close. And that unconscious memory can create in the soul a kind of diffuse spiritual guilt, a sense of unsettled debt that does not paralyze but weighs, especially in times like Holy Week, when the soul is particularly sensitive to everything unresolved in its history with God. This is the concrete reason Teresa would have placed such importance on reviewing the devotional spaces of the home before Holy Wednesday. Not to conduct a cold inventory of religious objects, but to do something far more personal and far more powerful, an honest review of the home's own devotional history. What devotions were begun and never completed? What promises were made before which images, and what became of them? What objects are there because someone placed them one day with an intention no one any longer remembers? Which rosaries have gone months without being prayed? Which holy water has gone weeks without being renewed? Which spent candles are waiting for someone to take them away? Each of those questions, answered honestly, is a step toward the interior order Teresa associated, directly with the soul's capacity to receive grace. Because the disorder in the home's devotional space is not merely an aesthetic or logistical disorder. It is the reflection of a deeper interior disorder, the disorder of incomplete intentions, of devotions unfinished, of conversations with God that were begun and left half open, without the formal gesture of closure that Catholic tradition offers precisely for this purpose. What is to be done with those objects? The Church has a clear, practical, and fully accessible answer for each type of devotional object that has stopped fulfilling its purpose. And that answer is neither simplistic nor uniform, because each type of object has its own appropriate treatment, one that respects both its sacred character and the practical reality of the homes where these objects are found. What the Church indicates about the proper way to retire those objects is itself, in its own right, an act of prayer, an act Teresa would have recognized immediately as part of the interior journey, not as a domestic chore separate from the spiritual life, but as one of its most concrete and most honest expressions. There comes a point in this conversation where the question is no longer which objects to remove, but how to remove them, and that question deserves a full answer. Because the manner in which sacred objects, or objects that have been part of the spiritual life of the home, are retired is not a matter of indifference. It is not a simple housekeeping exercise. When done in the way the Church indicates, it is an act of faith in itself, a prayer expressed in concrete gestures, a way of bringing spiritual histories to a close with the same dignity with which they were opened. Teresa of Avila understood this with a depth her writings in the Foundations revealed repeatedly. She described the care with which she handled every object in the oratories of her convents, not only when placing them, but also when the time came to remove them. Because for Teresa, the gesture of retiring an object from a sacred space was not a denial of its value. It was an affirmation of the order grace requires. It was the recognition that this object, in this moment, in this space, was no longer fulfilling the purpose for which it had been placed. And that recognition, made honestly and with respect, was itself a form of prayer the soul offered before speaking a single word. The Catholic Church has clear and specific guidance on the proper treatment of sacred objects that have reached the end of their useful life in the home. These guidelines are not arbitrary or purely ritualistic. They reflect a deep theological understanding of what happens when an object is consecrated to the service of God. That object enters into a relationship with the sacred that does not disappear simply because the object has deteriorated or fallen out of use. That relationship requires that its conclusion be treated with the same respect with which it was begun. For deteriorated sacred objects, those which through the passage of time, accident, or continued use can no longer fulfill their function, the Church offers two principal paths. The first is to bring them to the parish priest. Any deteriorated sacred object can be taken to the parish to be disposed of properly. The parish priest knows the appropriate procedures and has the authority to give them the treatment the Church indicates. This is the simplest and most complete option because it takes from the lay person the responsibility of determining the correct treatment for each type of object and places that determination in the hands of someone with the formation and authority to make it. The second path, for objects that cannot be transported or for which the priest indicates that home treatment is appropriate, is respectful burning. To burn a deteriorated sacred object is not a violent or irreverent gesture. In the Church's tradition, fire purifies and transforms. It is the same element the Church uses to produce the ashes of Ash Wednesday, to light the Paschal candle at the Vigil, to bless the palm branches that are then kept through the year. To burn a sacred object that can no longer fulfill its function is to return it to the purifying element in a gesture of respect that tradition recognizes as fitting. For broken or unused rosaries, worn holy cards, and scapulars that have lost their form, this process is particularly clear. They are gathered with reverence. A simple prayer of thanksgiving is offered for the service they gave, and they are burned in an appropriate place. Not tossed carelessly, but laid down with the same intention one would bring to an offering. The resulting ashes can be buried in garden soil or in a pot of earth, returning to the ground what the ground gave in its own time. For holy water that has remained too long in its vessel and is no longer in a condition to serve as the sign it is meant to be, the process is equally straightforward. It is poured out onto the earth, not down the drain alongside ordinary water, but onto the ground, which is the proper recipient for what has been consecrated and is returning to its natural state. That gesture, so simple it might seem inconsequential, carries a spiritual depth Teresa would have recognized immediately. It is the gesture of someone who knows that the sacred cannot be treated with the same indifference as the ordinary, even when the sacred has come to the end of its specific function. For spent candles, the remains of wax from candles that burned in prayer or in devotion before the Blessed Sacrament, the appropriate treatment is simply to remove them with care, recognizing that this consumed wax is the remnant of prayer that truly burned, and to dispose of it with respect, by burying the remains or by burning what remains in a fresh candle offered with a specific intention. And for inherited objects that have not yet been blessed, the process of setting things right is the simplest of all and the most urgent before Holy Wednesday. They are brought to the parish priest for a simple blessing or blessed in the home itself with fresh holy water and a prayer of consecration that can be as straightforward as this: Lord, receive this object that belonged to one who is now with you and which now belongs to this home that desires to serve you. Bless it, that it may be in these hands what it was in the hands that held it before, a path to you. That prayer, spoken in faith with fresh holy water over the object, is enough to formally incorporate it into the spiritual history of the new home, for it to leave behind the unfinished story and begin to belong to the living story of the home that receives it. Doing all of this before Holy Wednesday is not a heavy task, nor an unreasonable demand. Seen with Teresa's eyes, it is one of the most concrete and most honest ways of preparing the heart for the sacred Triduum, because what is retired with respect does not leave a void. It leaves a space, and a space in a Christian home, when it is clean and available, does not stay empty for long. What comes to fill it when the objects that were blocking grace have been properly removed is precisely the question this whole journey has kept open from the beginning, and whose answer, when it arrives, carries the weight of something Teresa knew firsthand and described with a precision that is rarely quoted in full. When Teresa prepared a new convent before the arrival of her sisters, there was something she invariably did after removing what did not belong. She placed what did. And that second gesture was for her as important as the first, perhaps more so, because she understood with a clarity few spiritual directors of her time shared that the soul cannot live in a vacuum. Not that emptiness is bad in itself. It is that the soul, by its very nature, is always oriented towards something. If that something has not been explicitly and discerningly chosen, the soul chooses on its own, and it does not always choose well. That is why the removal of grace-blocking objects is never in Teresian spirituality the end of the process. It is the first half of a process that is only complete when the freed space has been intentionally filled with what belongs to these days. And during Holy Week, what belongs to these days has a very precise identity that the Catholic tradition has preserved with extraordinary faithfulness across 20 centuries. The first of those objects is the most fundamental and the most ancient, the crucifix. Not just any crucifix placed anywhere, but the crucifix that during Holy Week occupies the most visible place in the home, clean, deliberately positioned at eye level in the space where the family gathers. A clean crucifix, consciously placed, is not merely a decorative object with religious meaning. It is a presence. It is a declaration the home makes about who is at the center of its life during these days. And when the soul enters that space, and the first thing its eyes find is the crucifix set in its proper place, it receives an instruction no book of spirituality can give with the same immediacy and the same force. Here, the Lord is the center. Everything else moves around him. The second image that belongs especially to Holy Week is Our Lady of Sorrows, the Mother at the foot of the cross. Her presence in the home during these days is not one pious option among many. It is the soul's entry into the mystery of compassion, into the grief that does not destroy but transforms, into the love that remains standing when everything else has fallen. Teresa of Avila's devotion to Our Lady was of a tenderness her writings describe in a way that still moves the heart today. She had learned in the darkest years of her spiritual life that Mary's presence in the home of the soul is not decorative. It is active. It is maternal. It is a constant intercession the soul receives, even when it does not clearly perceive it. The third element that Catholic tradition places in homes during Holy Week is the blessed olive branch. The branch received on Palm Sunday, that tradition calls us to keep in the home throughout the year, visible in a place where the family passes by it as a reminder of the Lord's entry into Jerusalem and as a sign of the peace he came to bring. That branch, blessed by the Church, is not a decorative object that can go anywhere. It is a sacred object that has been consecrated to serve the faith of the home. Placing it in its proper position during Holy Week is to acknowledge its purpose and let it fulfill it. And the fourth element, the one that closes the cycle and prepares the home for the most important moment of the liturgical year, is the Paschal candle, or in homes that do not have the candle proper, a white candle lit during moments of family prayer through the Triduum. Light is the preeminent sign of the resurrection. It is the sign the Church chooses for the most important night of the year. And when that light is present in the home, lit with intention during the most intense moments of the Triduum, it does something Teresa would have recognized immediately as an effect of grace. It orients the soul toward hope before the mind has had time to formulate it as a thought. In the interior castle, Teresa writes something that illuminates everything we have journeyed through here, with a precision that seems written for this exact moment. She says that the soul, which has cleared away its attachments, which has removed the obstacles standing between itself and God, does not simply settle into a state of greater passive availability. It enters a state of active openness that draws grace with a force that is not its own but God's, who responds to the disposition of the soul with a generosity that always exceeds any previous expectation. In her own words, Saint Teresa wrote in the interior castle that when the soul truly prepares itself, God does not delay in giving himself, because he desires to give himself more than we desire to receive him. And the only real obstacle between his desire and ours is ourselves and what we choose to place between him and us. That sentence carries particular weight when read in the context of everything we have covered here. Because what Teresa is saying is that preparing the home for the sacred Triduum is not a condition God imposes from the outside with arbitrary authority. It is the removal of obstacles we ourselves have placed, with or without intention, between his desire to give himself and our capacity to receive him. And when those obstacles are removed, what happens is not that God begins to move. God was already moving. what happens is that his movement toward us no longer meets resistance. The home that arrives at Holy Thursday with the crucifix clean in its place, with the image of Our Lady of Sorrows present, with the blessed olive branch in view, with the objects of noise put away, with the objects of ambiguous history set in order or removed, with the devotional spaces tended and alive, that home is not simply a tidier home than it was yesterday. It is a home that has made a decision the soul has expressed not in words, but in concrete gestures, in the silent language of objects that have or do not have their place. And that decision, made before the threshold of the Triduum, is what determines the quality of what those 3 sacred days can leave in the souls of those who live them in that space. But there remains one question this journey has kept open from the very beginning, the most important of all, the one Teresa answered with the greatest depth her writings contain. What exactly can God do in a home that awaits him like this, prepared and available during the 3 most sacred days of the year? There is one final foundation in Teresa of Avila's life that her biographers mention frequently, but whose most significant detail is rarely highlighted. It was in Burgos in the year 1582, the last year of her life. Teresa was 67 years old. She was ill with a seriousness she herself recognized. The journey to Burgos had been extraordinarily difficult. Extreme cold, the Arlanzon River flooded, obstacles piling one on top of another as if the foundation itself were being tested before it had even begun. And yet, the night before the first sisters took possession of the new house, Teresa did exactly what she had done in each of her previous foundations. She walked through every room. She ordered every space. She placed every object in its position. She prepared the oratory with the same care she would have given it if she had been 20 years old, with 30 foundations still ahead of her, rather than making her last. That image, Teresa, elderly and ill, preparing an oratory the night before her final foundation, is the most honest image we can have of what she believed about the relationship between prepared space and arriving grace. She did not do it out of habit. She did not do it because she had nothing else to occupy her. She did it because she knew, with the certainty that only a lifetime lived in the presence of God can give, that preparing the space is not a prelude to the spiritual experience. It is part of the spiritual experience. It is the first offering the soul makes before speaking a single word. What can God do in a home that awaits him in this way, prepared and available, during the sacred Triduum? Teresa answered this question in the interior castle with a depth that her words transmit to this day, with a freshness that has lost none of its force. In the 7th dwelling places, the innermost ones closest to the center where God dwells in the soul, Teresa describes what happens when all the obstacles have been removed and the soul stands fully available to receive what God desires to give. She does not describe it as an extraordinary experience reserved for the most advanced souls. She describes it as the natural and almost inevitable consequence of the soul's disposition, as though God had been waiting for that moment with a patience that surpasses all human understanding. And when the moment comes, when the soul has finally removed everything that stood between them, his response is immediate, generous, and utterly disproportionate to any previous expectation. What God can do in a prepared home on Holy Thursday is make the Last Supper not merely an event that the liturgy commemorates in church, but something the soul lives in the quiet of its own dining room, at the table where the family eats every day, which on that Thursday becomes the place where the love of Christ makes itself present in a way that needs no words to be recognized. What God can do on Good Friday in a prepared home is bring to the crucifix in the living room a presence that makes looking at it unlike looking at it on any other Friday of the year. The eyes that rest on that crucifix see something different, not because the crucifix has changed, but because the soul that is looking has removed everything that was preventing it from seeing. and what God can do during the Easter Vigil in a home that has arrived at that moment with its space in order, with its devotional objects active and present, with noise removed and spiritual history set right, is fulfill exactly what Teresa described in the 7th dwelling places. The union of the soul with God that is not a fusion that erases the soul's identity, but a presence that completes it. A peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of God. A joy that does not depend on external circumstances, because it comes from within, from the center where God has at last found a clean space to dwell without resistance. In her own words, Saint Teresa wrote in the interior castle that in these interior dwelling places the soul feels a companionship that never leaves it, and that this companionship transforms everything, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the same silent and steady way that light transforms a room that had been in darkness, without announcing itself, without asking permission, simply being present and changing everything by that presence alone. That is what the sacred Triduum can do in a prepared home. Not an extraordinary mystical experience reserved for the most spiritually advanced souls, but something far more accessible and far more real, the quiet certainty that God is there, in that home, in those rooms that were cleaned with intention, in those spaces where now there is only what belongs to these days. The certainty that the Passion of Christ is not merely an event that happened 2,000 years ago, but something happening now, in this home, with this family, with these people who chose to prepare themselves, and who can therefore receive what cannot be received without preparation. Teresa had always known this, but she confirmed it with final clarity on that last night in Burgos, preparing alone the oratory of her last foundation, knowing she might not live to see the next Triduum, and doing it anyway with the same attention and the same care as the very first time, because she had come to understand that preparing a space for God is not a duty fulfilled when circumstances are easy. It is an act of love performed precisely when circumstances are hard, when the body is tired, when time is pressing, when it would be far simpler to leave it for tomorrow. Because God does not look at the perfection of the gesture. He looks at the intention of the heart that makes it. And a home prepared with imperfect love and limited time, but prepared with genuine faith before Holy Wednesday, is exactly the home the Lord is searching for. To pour out upon it, during the 3 most sacred days of the year, all that His love has been waiting for the right moment to give. And that moment for you, for your home, for the people who live in it, and for those you have entrusted to God without quite knowing since when, that moment is now. Today, this Holy Wednesday, before the sun finishes setting and the Triduum begins, without you having crossed the threshold, prepared to receive it with everything you are and everything you have. You have walked through every corner of your home with Teresa's eyes. You have seen the objects of noise, the objects with stories left open, the devotional spaces waiting to be renewed. And you have heard what the Church indicates for treating them with the respect they deserve. You did not find your way here by accident. You came because something in you already knew that this Holy Wednesday was different, and that your home could be too. What Teresa warned about was never a burden. It was an invitation, and you received it. There is another journey waiting for you. There are souls who crossed this threshold before you, and who left traces in Teresa's writings that we have not yet read together. There are questions your heart is already forming about what happens during the Triduum in homes that prepared themselves and in souls that truly made themselves ready. Those answers are in the video now appearing on your screen. Don't leave it for later. The Triduum is drawing near, and what you are about to hear there is the natural next step of everything you received here. Teresa did not end her journey in Burgos. She kept going, and you can keep going right now. May the Lord bless your home this Holy Wednesday. May every object you remove in faith open a space He rushes to fill. May the Triduum that begins find your house prepared and your heart available. Teresa of Avila, who prepared so many oratories with her own tired hands, walks with you today as you prepare yours. And as she herself wrote, "Let nothing trouble you, let nothing frighten you. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone is enough." Until we meet again, and may the peace of this Holy Week remain in your home long after these days have passed.